ages long. What do we do when it's peace that we want? When it's more than a person can build or plant? We'll gather our friends from the ends of the earth to lend a hand in its hour of birth. We'll plow, we'll sow, we'll hammer, and we'll nail, we'll work all day till peace is what? For our hands are strong and our hearts are young, and the dreamer keeps the dreaming. Ages, the hands are strong and our hearts are young, and the dreamer keeps the dreaming. Ages long. Thank you all. I appreciate that. So happy New Year for the trees. I hope we all enjoy it. I know that there are cookies also. That wonderful way to end a meal. And now I would like to invite Early our dog to share a few words. Am I done too early? Are we okay? We're good. Excellent. All right. So Early, this whole evening was Early's child, and we thank her for that.
Thank you. So it's really, it was an idea that I had because we've been doing those events before and we really loved it. And I couldn't do it without the help of lots of volunteers. So it's thanks for everybody who helped and thanks for the synagogue for doing this. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Nalini Nadkarni, who's a friend. She is a forest ecologist and a science communicator. That's what she told me she was doing. She's done a lot of things, so I'm just going to give you a little brief review of what she does. So she was a faculty member at the Evergreen State College for 20 years, and in 2011 she moved with her family to Salt Lake City. And she joined the University of Utah as a professor of biology and the director of Center for Science and Mathematics Education. She received her Bachelor's of Science degree from Brown University, and then she got her PhD from the University of Washington. And now she has a very long list of awards, and I'll just read a few of them. She had the Guggenheim Fellowship, an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship, the 2011 NSF Public Service Award, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science Award for Public Engagement in 2012. Her research concerns the ecological roles of canopy dwelling biota in forest ecosystems, and she'll tell us a bit about this. She's published over 100 scientific articles, and that's a lot, and 4 scholarly books. She's deeply interested in public engagement of science and has given 2 TED Talks, and I encourage everybody to try to listen to them. She's also been highlighted in magazines such as National Geographic, Glamour Magazine, and Playboy. And I actually looked it up, it's true. So Playboy puts a list of the nation's most influential and imaginative college professors, and Nalini was featured in that, and I think it's really cool. So for all the scientists out there, we have something to look forward to. She also created the Research Ambassador Program to train scientists to engage the public in non-traditional venues, such as preschools, churches, synagogues, and sports stadiums. And in 2005, she co-founded the Sustainability in Prisons project, which brings science and nature to incarcerated men and women, which is now being expanded to a national level. So this is a really short list. She does a lot. She's a wonderful example of people from academia doing a lot of community work. And she is a great speaker, so I'd love to welcome you. If your kids don't listen to this, there is childcare in the room at the entrance, so if they are They would rather do other things. And it's supervised and it's great. So enjoy.
While we're getting ready and setting up, just a couple of quick things. I'm going to ask you, while Dr. Nadkarni is speaking, that you not bust your tables, but that you do bust your tables at some point this evening. Also, the religious school is going to be having a Tu B'Shvat Seder on Wednesday, and we're going to use the same books. And so if you don't want to take them home because they are precious to you now and you feel an affinity towards them, please put them on the stage as you are leaving so that you can continue to use them and use more resources. Thank you.
Great. Does that sound okay?
Yes, sounds great.
So I'd first like to thank Orly and Matthew and the synagogue here. It's really a pleasure to come here. My family also came, my husband Jack and our daughter Erica. So it's really great to be able to come to the synagogue and to share with you some of the ideas that I've been looking into in terms of the links between trees and spirituality. And one of the things that I found in my research in all of this actually came from the German poet and writer Hermann Hesse. He wrote a fantastic essay called On Trees. I'd like to start with a quote from that. He said, "For me, trees have always been the most penetrating creatures. Trees are sanctuaries. Whoever has learned how to speak to them, whoever knows how to listen to them, can learn the truth. They preach the ancient law of life." And I'm really here at this sort of pulpit, I guess, or bema in a way, tonight because I and many others share a sort of a spiritual connection as well as a professional connection to trees. I spent my professional life learning about trees and their ecological importance to other parts of landscapes and to humans, how they provide nesting places for birds and mammals, flower, nectar, shade, lumber, fruit, all of the things that we heard about in the Seder tonight. And as with many of you, I'm getting increasingly aware of the dangers that trees and forests are feeling right now. We tend to base our efforts in terms of development on economics and political and economic values of trees. But I think we need to go beyond that in terms of inciting ourselves to be better stewards of trees. And so what I'd like to do with you this evening in about 20 minutes or half an hour or so is to share with you some of the non-academic ways that I've come to understand that we might need to move towards in order to protect trees. I think it's really appropriate to do this on Tu B'Shvat, to speak about these strong spiritual links between trees and humans. Hermann Hesse also wrote in that essay, "In the tree's highest boughs, the world rustles. Their roots rest in infinity. Nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than a beautiful, strong tree." And my own affinity for trees started not in graduate school, but rather as a kid, climbing trees in my parents' home in Bethesda, Maryland. When I climbed, I had this sort of large, chaotic family, and I knew that I needed a place that was sort of peaceful and serene and promised me a place that was safe. And that turned out to be the tops of the trees in my parents' backyard. Since then, I developed a profession of understanding trees, teaching ecology at the university, doing tree research. But I also realized that science really could be a mechanism for understanding trees and inciting stewardship for them. So just a little bit about my own scientific background. I studied the forest canopies of trees in Costa Rica. In the treetops, I use a variety of ways to get up into trees, mountain climbing techniques and hot air balloons and construction cranes. And when I get up there, I really enter a different world, a world that is both secure and dangerous, a world that is diverse and contains and supports animals that you never see on the forest floor, but a world that is also endangered and threatened by human activities, by mining, by land conversion, by global climate change, and mainly by people who live in cities, for example, who don't have daily contact with trees, who don't understand that connection between trees and their food, trees and their shelter, trees and their spiritual life. And so it seemed to me that almost out of desperation, I had felt that I needed to use all the tools that I could to gather all of the values that humans have for trees in order to convince people that we should take better care of them. And what I'd like to share with you tonight is values that are connected with trees that I've discovered over the past few years. And I'd like to first share with you my own spiritual roots. I actually am a Hindu. My dad was from India. He was raised as a Hindu. He was a pharmacologist. My mother comes from Russian parentage. She was raised in Brooklyn, New York as an Orthodox Jew. And so in my family, we had this little altar with Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, and right next to it was the menorah, as well as photographs of my relatives, my grandparents who came over, and their ancestors. They fled the pogroms of Russia back in the early 1900s. And so there were these images of my relatives who I realized if I looked at their strong, silent, somewhat alien faces, that I could trace the line of a jaw or the breadth of a shoulder, looking at myself and my brothers and sisters. So I know that that is part of my heritage as well. I described this, so what I'm really going to be talking to is not sort of promoting any single faith, because I come from two very different ones. And I'm not really coming here as a scientist, but I'm coming here as a human being who cares about trees and who is very deeply interested in wanting to see how we can help them drawing upon spiritual faiths. My strategy in doing this was to explore some of the holy writings of all the world religions and allow the scriptures of those world religions, the Quran, the Bible, the Talmud, to tell me what the values of trees are to people of that faith. So what I'd like to do tonight is to relate the sources that identify values of trees in world religions, including Judaism, and to talk about those values as they might help us be better stewards of trees. I'll start out with just some connections from the faith of Judaism first. Second, I'll talk about some common threads from some of the other world religions that teach us about trees and spirituality. And thirdly, I'll just invite some other interactions that we might have with trees moving towards conservation and stewardship. But before that, I do that, I'd like to go into two things. First is to simply give you a definition of spirituality. The Dalai Lama, a very spiritual person, said, spirituality is about the essence. It's about contentment, about connections, about caring, about sharing, about calming, about connections. The second thing I'd like to do is to invite you to think and envision a tree that is special to you. And I know everybody has some tree in the past, a tree that was outside your window when you grew up, a tree that you might have planted when you had your son or daughter, a tree that you might have planted when your parent died. But to come just to a visual image of a tree that's special to you, and I'll give you just a minute to think of that tree. And when you have it, I invite you to just sort of keep a hold of that special tree, your own special tree, as I speak about trees in general during the rest of my talk. So I'd like to start with Judaism and think about the connections between trees and the faith of Judaism. If we can start with the Old Testament, we, of course, as soon as we open up the Old Testament, we come to be acquainted with two very important trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in that we read in Genesis 2, we learn, the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So right there, when I started reading the Old Testament, I realized that trees are extremely fundamental in terms of religious symbolism, in terms of religious importance. What I did next after I read that first page was to download the Old Testament from the web and do a search for the word trees and forests. And I created a little, of course, a scientist, I had to figure out, well, what is the meaning of all these verses? There were 328 verses in the Old Testament, and I then categorized each of those verses into one of the six categories that you see on your handout that I think has been handed out to you. And you can see here symbolic and aesthetic use of trees, analogies to life and God, practical use like food, like what we did tonight, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, and just a few references to tree biology. So what I learned from this really is that in the lives of Jews, trees are very important from the standpoint of both real and actual values as well as metaphorical and symbolic values. And that is something that we've learned tonight as we went through the Seder for Tu Shabbat. We also know that Tu Shabbat is a time when we might take this knowledge of the many values of trees, and to plant trees, to raise money to plant trees in Israel. That's something that we tend to do around this holiday. So there's a connection to the values of trees and their preservation. But in addition to these sort of literal values of trees, the shade they cast, the fruit they provide with us, the Bible and the Torah also tell us that there are analogies, there are metaphors of trees and humans. For example, in the Torah we read in Deuteronomy 20, a person is like a tree of the field. In Isaiah 65, as for the days of the tree shall be the days of my people. In Jeremiah 17, he will be like a tree planted near water. So we see then that we are like trees when in the eyes of the Torah. We also know the tradition of the Sabbath, to consume less, to use less, to stop ourselves in the daily round. So every seventh day, the Sabbath, every Saturday, we stop what we're doing. I remember stories of my Orthodox Jewish mother, where they couldn't even turn the electric lights on Sabbath. They had to sit in darkness and take a break from their daily life. But we also know from the Bible that it is wise to stop the use of their fields every seventh year, to give it a rest, to give it a break, which is a very ecological concept in terms of preserving one's resources. Another aspect of Judaism, of course, is the Kabbalah and the idea of Tikkun Olam, that is, the most important ethical injunction of the Kabbalah, the command that humanity must restore the broken world. That is, when God made creation, he had to actually contain himself. And in doing so, he had to make room and had to take some of the extra light and put them in vessels. And some of those vessels split apart. And the light was scattered around the universe. And some of it was drawn back. But now there are still these shards of light that must be gathered together to create that perfect world that God asks us to. And so right now there are shards that represent evil, that represent the material world, that we must work. We must commit the act of Tikkun Olam to pull those together. So the word Tikkun Olam now really means, or has come to mean the idea of social justice, but it can also mean environmental justice. It can also mean that we must commit acts that will make the earth whole, as well as our society. If we continue then along this commonality of religions, the idea is that not only Judaism but other religions see these same things, we can think about some of the commonalities also. And I'd like to describe 5 of them that we find commonalities of the connections between humans and trees in all of the world religions. One of them is, the first one, I think is the most important, and that is that trees are connected to truth and enlightenment. The Old English word for tree was troth, T-R-O-T-H, which means truth. And I had a poet friend named Craig Carlson who said that if you meet someone who says he's speaking the truth, then you should look for something with a strong trunk, with deep roots, and something that sweeps the sky. And that, I think, is something that we all look for in our spiritual work. When you come to the synagogue, you're looking for something that has a strong trunk, that has deep roots, and something that sweeps the sky. And we see that in the architecture of Christian churches, of cathedrals. Gothic cathedrals are tree-like in form. When you go inside them, your eyes move up, following up, and your spirit moves up into the top of that cathedral. When we think about going to the redwoods, well, one of the most important and oldest groves of redwoods is called Cathedral Grove. So that too is this understanding that trees and cathedral move our eyes and our spirits upward. The Mormon religion also exhibits this in 1 Nephi 8. We learn about the dream of Lehi. And he had a dream of a tree with white fruits, with a rod leading to it. And this is a tree that represents enlightenment to Mormons. And so the tree was the same kind of symbol as what we see in other religions. We also think about how the rootedness of trees connects to the skies. Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Hindu poet, said that trees are the earth's endless efforts to speak to the listening heavens. And in fact, when you look at the Muslim religion, this is the word for Allah that's written over here on your left. They actually capture images of trees that have what seem to be the word Allah written in the branches of the trees. And if you go to the web and look up tree and Allah, you'll find pages page after page of trees that have branches in the shape of Allah. And so that's this sort of, again, this remarkable connection between trees and the connection, trees and the connection to truth, trees and the connection to enlightenment. Well, we can also see that truth and enlightenment are everywhere if we think about the form of trees. That we see tree forms in rivers, we see tree forms in caves and neurons, we see tree forms in blood vessels. This is a picture of a human heart. And I don't know about you, but when I look at the blood vessels in that heart, I see the image of trees. And so we can think then that the image of trees, that dendritic pattern, also reminds us of the presence of God in everything, that they can link us to the heavens. A second general area that world religions tell us about is that trees are linked to breathing, something that is very, very both symbolic and also very spiritual. The Hebrew word for breath is neshima, the same root of the word for soul, which is neshama. The spiritual life force comes in metaphorically through our lungs by the air and respiration, and we know that trees, their photosynthesis is that exchange of gases. It takes the carbon dioxide that we breathe out, and it allows us to breathe in the oxygen that it creates every single day that it's exposed to sunlight. So wherever we are, we can notice that breathing in and out is evocative of trees and responsible for the oxygen that we get. And so each time we breathe, we can be reminded of that spiritual act. Another spiritual aspect is trees and silence. And here I bring the religion of Buddhism into play. The Buddhists have a word for silence, which is samatha. This is the cultivation, the spiritual cultivation that's concerned with the calming of the mind. The mind is capable of stillness and is put into sort of a state that's suitable for the arising of insight and wisdom. And if you remember the word, that definition of the Dalai Lama, a Buddhist, who said that part of spirituality is calmness, we can also think about trees and spirituality. Because that practice focuses on looking at something that is static, looking at something that is silent. And so when you assume a pose in a Buddhist sit, one of the best things that you can do is to focus on a tree, either mentally or physically, because of its silence, because of its rootedness, because of its immobility. We are connected then through trees in Buddhism, through silence, to something that is spiritual. Wendell Berry wrote a wonderful poem about this. It's called, "I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet. Around me like circles on water. What I fear in it leaves me, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its silent song." A fifth aspect is trees and time. Really, trees help humans spell time. They tell us the seasons. Nothing more, to me anyway, nothing more effectively tells me what season it is than looking out at these beautiful hills and seeing the yellows of the aspen trees, or the tender green twigs of springtime, or the delicate filigree of twigs of trees with the snow that coats them in the wintertime. And in the longer time scale, forests teach us the dynamic nature of nature. They measure our year with their rings. They speak of time itself. They give us the gift of longevity. This bristlecone pine that's 4,600 years, that was born 2,000 years before Christ was born. This is the gift of time that trees link us to. This longevity also reminds us of endurance. The word tree, actually the root of it comes from the Sanskrit deru, which means strong, endure, endurance, and truth. So those trees that are old definitely bring us to mind of this important spiritual aspect of understanding time. Trees and hidden worlds. We know that trees manifest symbolic hidden worlds. Most when we look at trees, that they're above ground world, happily making leaves, happily making oxygen, happily providing nesting sites for birds. But we know that they have another whole world, and that is the underground world of their roots. The symbiosis that they have with microorganisms, with fungi that connect them to other trees. They gather the water, they gather the nutrients, and so they're fundamental to the tree, and yet we never see those roots. And those tree roots, I think, also symbolize that which we keep hidden from ourselves, our troubles, our failings, our addictions, our fears, the darkest part of ourselves. But to be truthful, to be full of trough, like a tree, we must recognize those parts of ourselves. And because like a tree's roots, those hidden parts are also part of ourselves. And we know that revealing these roots can often very much free ourselves of those dark, hidden parts. If we can speak to our spouses, to our friends, to our siblings, to our rabbi, that's the first step in terms of finding the way and the strength to overcome them. And so, again, to just kind of bring that out, I want to say one more poem by David Wagner, a poem called Lost, who tells us of the forest that he has found and lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes behind you are not lost. Wherever you are, it's called here. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers. No trees are the same to Raven. If what a bush or tree does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows you, and where you are, you must let it find you. So when we recognize these many spiritual values that connect us to calm, to silence, to time, to finding ourselves after being lost, we can think about those ways that might then instill in us and others a way to protect trees. On a very concrete level, we know that there are lots of ways that we can help trees. You can join the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, Tree Utah. You can join these and have a greater part in conservation. There are other religions that have other ways of doing this. The Hindus have what they call the sacred groves. These are the places where they believe the spirits actually live. And these sacred groves, tiny little pockets of primary forest that still remain in the populated country of India, are the places where we see some of the few examples of remaining endangered species. And that is because of the spiritual connection that people had that protected those sacred groves. On a more immediate basis, some of the things that my students and I are trying to do is to remind ourselves here in Salt Lake City that in fact we have sacred groves also. And so what we've been doing is mapping and documenting the trees in churchyards. My students and I go out, I didn't bring my booklet, but I have some. You can come to me and take a look at it. So we make these little booklets. This is one that we made for St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral downtown. We mapped every tree. We made a little booklet that described and named the species of the tree, but also biblical quotes that related to particular species and biological information that related to particular species, hoping that that would help the congregation realize that, in fact, trees in the churchyards are sacred, just as the buildings are, just as the Bible is, just as the pulpit is. And so we've been going around the city now trying to do this same sort of thing in many places of worship. We would love to come here and call on me and do the same thing here, so that we could help each other come to understand the preservation, the conservation, and in some ways the symbolic stewardship of trees, and what else trees represent, which is every other part of nature that also resides on your synagogue grounds. So after we consider these many spiritual connections, I'd like to invite you to go back to that tree that I asked you to figure out your special tree, and go back to the image that you might have of that special tree. I'd like you to think about how that tree is all trees, that all trees are part of all nature, that the water that evaporates from our beautiful Great Salt Lake and rests for a time in our beautiful mountains, and then flows through our canyons to water the trees that grow right here on your church ground, your synagogue grounds. All of those are the same thing. They're all connected, that most important word in terms of spirituality. And by connecting with your single tree and becoming aware of the spirituality within that tree and within yourself, my hope is that we can, within each of us, within this beautiful world, this troubled world, this place where trees are both planted and threatened, that we can come to understand the importance of trees and become more aware of how we are connected to them. This brings us back to the Dalai Lama's definition of spirituality. Spirituality is about the essence. Contentment, caring, sharing, calming, and connection. Human beings have a natural affinity for trees. I hope you take the image of your tree and and these spiritual values and put them together when you see any tree or any forest, that you will stop. You will breathe in and out as a tree does, and know that you are touching something full of truth, of trough, something with a strong trunk, something with deep roots, and something that sweeps the sky. Thank you.
Dr. Nadkarni is generous enough to offer. If anyone has questions or wants to share, please feel free.
Or comments or things I've had left out. I love to speak at churches and synagogues because people always remind me, we have a hymn that we sing about trees that you didn't mention, so please do that too.
Either from the top of your head or where I can find some information about the benefit of trees to clean air in terms of the whole cycle, the breathing of the trees and carbon dioxide.
Yes, sure.
When we kill trees, what happens to the air, and where can I find facts on that?
That's actually something that's really important. I think there's some, and I don't mean to pull down the importance of trees at all, but I think it is a misconception that trees actually purify air. That is, that when particulates fall on them, they somehow take them in and then do something with them and then get rid of them or something like that, because they actually don't do that. So I would recommend, I'm trying to remember of the Clean Air group, maybe some of you can help me. Yeah, Breathe Utah has some really excellent material, so I refer you to those. And there's another woman at the university, and you can check out her website. Her name is Diane Pataki, P-A-T-A-K-I. She's a fabulous tree physiologist and ecologist and urban ecologist, and her specialty is the importance of trees in urban areas. She's worked here in Salt Lake City, she's worked in LA, she's back now on the faculty in the Department of Biology. And she's doing some superb work on exactly your question of what is the story of urban trees? Are they using too much water? Should we be planting these deciduous trees? Are they using too much? Or are they actually retaining it because of the shade that they provide? So she's really trying to examine this idea of heat islands and how trees reduce those. She's interested in the concept that you're talking about, which is what is the mechanism by which trees might improve the air quality, something. So please take a look at her website. Just go to the University of Utah and look up Diane Pataki.
I just wanted to add something to trees and air quality, because trees can actually really hurt our air quality, and that is when you're burning wood. That's why they say don't burn wood on red air days, and a recent study that's come out of the University of Utah has confirmed how dangerous that is. Mm-hmm. So I urge you all not to burn wood when we're having inversions and bad air times.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I think it's just...
Yes. I was born and raised in Himalaya, and I heard this since I was a child about the banyan tree. Can you tell us a little bit about the banyan tree, please?
Sure. So the banyan tree is a fabulous tree. It's definitely on my top 10 species of trees. It's in the fig family, the Moraceae, and it has a peculiar growth form where it grows with a single trunk, and as it ages, it's actually capable of growing roots from its own trunk down to the ground. And so what you end up seeing in an old banyan tree is a tree that appears to have multiple trunks, sometimes hundreds of trunks that are actually coming from the same tree. So that is kind of this bizarre growth. It's bizarre to us because we live in a place where that sort of thing doesn't happen, but that's a very characteristic architecture of the banyan tree. It's also a very important tree in India, and maybe also from where you are from, in that very often in villages there was a central banyan tree, which is where the elders would meet. They would sit in the shade of that tree and make decisions for the village. The panchayat, it was called. And so that place, of a place where there was shade, where there were these multi-trunks, where there would be monkeys and fruit and birds coming in, was really the heart, the center, politically and socially, of that village. And so that banyan tree is something that's very, very important in terms of the consciousness of how people think about trees and the places where they live. The Bodhi tree is a tree that Buddha achieved enlightenment. So there's another connection there between trees as places of enlightenment. And so he was actually born near a banyan tree, and that's where he sat. And he sat for 3 days until he became the enlightened one. And so there's a connection there again of the banyan tree, particularly with Buddha and finding enlightenment. So it has all kinds of implications, that particular tree. It's very speciose. There are lots and lots of species of banyan trees. They really are truly spectacular trees. So if there's any, if you want to just sort of sit around and think about, gee, what's an interesting tree species to think or look about or learn about, that would be a fabulous one to work on.
Here in Salt Lake, we have a wide variety of tree species that, because of the way things were planted here, there weren't that many trees here when the pioneers came. And this gives us a variety of trees with vulnerabilities that are different, and that may be changing over time in view of a changing climate. And I'm wondering if we should be thinking about, if we're losing trees. For example, we recently had a pine scale epidemic here. Many trees were lost. So what we might be thinking about, what we might plan to replace trees that are now being perhaps lost due to drought or to infestations.
Absolutely, that's a great question. It's a wonderful observation. I mean, it's a wonderful observation. It's a depressing observation as well.
What if you have suggestions?
And I don't really have direct suggestions. I'm sort of new to this place myself, so I'm getting my own feel of what works here. Before I came to Utah just 2 years ago, I lived for 20 years with my family in Olympia, Washington, where the tree scene, as you might imagine, is rather different than what it is here in Salt Lake Valley. So my sort of gut knowledge of trees and what belongs here is something that I'm learning myself. But again, there's some wonderful resources here in Salt Lake City. Tree Utah is one of the really great sort of community forestry and community groups that's here, and I think can provide some information. Again, Diane Pataki and her colleagues are working on that very question. So that's really trying to understand, and I think what most people are thinking of is global climate change and its potential effects and what's going to happen as we really start feeling those effects. And what are the implications then in terms of what trees we should be planting for the future. So I'm afraid I can't rattle off 5 species for you to put in your own backyard, but I think we have some resources here that could help with that.
So a couple of comments and a question.
Sure.
The first is, I'm thinking of the prophetess Deborah in the Torah who offered judgment. People would come to her, and I can't remember what kind of a tree it was, but she probably know. And then my other comment is, my name is Karen, and I teach drama at the Viola School, and every year for Jewish Bob we do a 7th grade production of the great K-pop tree by Lynn
Oh, yeah, sure. She's a great colleague of mine, yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if you could comment on the K-pop tree, and if you have, I know it's a huge topic, but just an update on the rainforest.
That's a big topic. I think, in a nutshell here, since it is Tu Shabbat, we can put it in a nutshell. There's more and more work being done, more and more awareness of the importance of the rainforest. I think, that just goes without saying now. I think there are more and more groups, nonprofits, agencies, and especially, I think most significant and important are groups within the tropical countries themselves that are mobilizing. It's no longer just these gringos that are sort of coming down and saying, oh, you have to hold up your rainforest because you've got great medicines for our cancers and so forth. I mean, that's important, but it's sort of going beyond that now. I think one of the cutting edge things that's going on in terms of large scale conservation are carbon credits. That is, there are carbon mitigation banks now that when people are developing either in the tropics or here, that there are now places, for instance, in Costa Rica, I'm familiar with that area because that's where I do my work, where carbon credits are real. They are really being used for conservation. My family and I were in Costa Rica over Christmas, and we were hiking through this beautiful area of conserved area of tropical rainforest, a place called Poco Sol. And a number of the park guards were actually, their salaries were being paid for by the equivalent of carbon credits. So I was blown away by the fact that actually that was on the ground. It was doing exactly the work that it could. Now, that's an optimistic statement, and I don't know whether that, what that means in other countries. But I think if there's a place to think about work, that is a place where the developed country and the less developed country or the tropical countries where the resources are that are so fragile and so needful of being protected, there can be a really strong connection there.
Going back to the preceding, unaccustomed as I am to answering my husband's questions. The Utah State University Extension Service has an experimental tree station, and they have hundreds of varieties that they're testing over 20 years each, and they test its response to changes in temperature, humidity, water supply, infestations, etc. So there is indeed a base for all of this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us this evening. I would share with you that you know that the Torah is also called Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And so when you talk about something with a strong foundation, deep roots, and a future, I know that we all resonated as Jews with this notion of Eitz Chaim. He is a living tree, and it is a tree of life for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Orly. Thank you so much, Nalini, everyone that helped put this together today. I know the food was spectacular. I also know that we don't have synagogue elves. I've been trying to find out about them. Apparently they don't exist. And what that means is that setup takes a while, and takedown takes a while too. And so I'm encouraging you and I'm recruiting you to the Tu B'Shvat committee. You are the cleanup crew. Thank you so much. So please help us clean up, help us get this room ready for tomorrow, for religious school, and for the concert tomorrow evening. Shavua Tov.
Yes.